They say the wind in the Texas panhandle sounds like a dying animal, a long, low howl that scrapes across the plains, dragging dust and regret with it. This was the place God forgot to finish, a stretch of sun-scorched earth called the Samarin Flats, where the sky was too big and men's souls were too small. To Colt Remington, it was just the last place on the map that hadn't buried him yet. He rode alone, the creak of worn leather and the steady clop of his horse's hooves, the only rhythm in a world gone silent. His horse, Dusty, a gray gelding with more scars than sense, snorted against the wind. But Colt didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on a scar of leaning fences and a lopsided barn that bled into the dying sun, the McGraw Ranch. The sign at the gate flapped on rusted chains, the words McGrawLivestock barely visible. Colt swung a stiff leg over his saddle. 42 hard years were carved into his face, around pale blue eyes that had seen too much. His wife Martha, taken by the fever. His boy Samuel gone just the same. All that was left of Colt Remington were ghosts, a revolver, and a need for a good saddle. Even a man with nothing left to live for needed something sturdy to sit on. He knocked once on the door of the tired gray house. It swung open immediately. Jed McGraw filled the doorway like a boulder, his red face slick with sweat, a toothpick dancing in the corner of his mouth. His eyes, small and mean, flicked over Colt, lingering on the worn grip of the revolver at his hip. "Don't get many strangers out this way," McGraw grunted. "Heard you got saddles." Colt's voice was flat, like the land around them. McGraw's lips curled into a sneer. "Best damn tack this side of Amarillo. But good ain't cheap. I'm not here to haggle." A jerk of McGraw's head pointed toward the barn. "Back there. Take a look." Colt's boots crunched on the hard-packed dirt as he followed. The barn groaned with every gust of wind, a tired old beast sighing its last breaths. Inside, the air was thick with the familiar smell of hay, leather, and sweat. It was almost comforting. The saddles hung on wooden racks, their craftsmanship solid and true, the kind of work you could trust your life with. But as Colt stepped deeper into the shadows, a sound cut through the quiet, a sound that didn't belong. It was a muffled sob, faint and raw. Colt's whole body went rigid, his hand drifting instinctively toward his belt, his fingers brushing the cool steel of his revolver. He scanned the dark corners of the barn, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. "You got livestock penned up back there?" Colt asked, his voice low, casual. Too casual. McGraw's expression soured instantly. "Storage," he snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. "Ain't your concern." But it was too late. Colt's boots were already moving, carrying him past the rows of saddles, toward a stack of large crates covered in a mold-speckled canvas. The sobbing came again, clearer this time. Desperate, human. With a swift, powerful motion, he yanked the canvas aside, and his world tilted on its axis. There, lashed tight with thick hemp rope, was a shipping crate. A crude wooden box, barely large enough to hold a grown man. But it wasn't a man inside. Staring back at him were two sets of eyes wide and sunken, filled with a terror that clawed at Colt's soul. A boy, no more than 9, filthy and skinny, was crouched protectively over a smaller form. A little girl, maybe 6, her cheeks flushed with fever, her lips cracked and bleeding. The air left Colt's lungs. The ghosts of his own wife and son screamed in his ears. He turned slowly, his pale blue eyes locking onto McGraw. The words came out in a low, dangerous growl. "You bastard!" McGraw's heavy hand clamped down on Colt's shoulder, trying to spin him around, trying to assert his dominance. "I told you, ain't your business." Colt moved like a coiled rattlesnake. He spun, shoving McGraw back with such force that the bigger man stumbled, his boots skidding in the dust. Colt's hand didn't just hover near his gun now. It was on it. The worn grip felt like an extension of his own hand, a part of his very being. "They yours?" Colt asked, his voice the grinding of stone on stone. McGraw spat on the barn floor, his bravado returning. "Their mama owed me. She's dead. A debt's a debt." He looked at the children with cold indifference, as if they were nothing more than sacks of grain. Inside the crate, the boy's gaze met Colt's. It was a look of pure, unyielding defiance, a fire that hadn't been extinguished by days, maybe weeks, in that dark, suffocating box. His small arms, trembling with exhaustion, stayed locked around his sister. Colt didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He just asked a simple question that would change everything. "How much?" McGraw blinked, thrown off balance. "For the saddle?" "For them." A snort of derisive laughter escaped McGraw's lips, but a glint of greed flickered in his eyes. This stranger was a fool, a bleeding heart with more silver than sense. "They ain't cheap," he sneered. "Cost you more than any saddle." Colt didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. The clink of silver dollars echoed in the tense silence of the barn. He upended the pouch, and his life savings, a dozen silver dollars from a long cattle drive up north, spilled into the dirt between them. "That enough?" McGraw's eyes darted to the silver, his mind doing a quick, greedy calculation. He spat in the dirt again. "More trouble than they're worth, anyway," he grumbled, but he kicked a small, rusted key toward Colt's feet. The deal was done. Colt knelt by the crate, his fingers fumbling with the old stiff lock. The boy inside tensed, pulling his sister even closer, shielding her with his own small body. "Easy," Colt said, his voice suddenly softer than it had been in years. "I ain't here to hurt you." The girl whimpered, her face burning with fever, her eyes glassy and unfocused. The boy's stare, however, never wavered. He was a tiny general guarding his last soldier. "Name's Colt," he said, finally getting the lock to turn. "You're coming with me." For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. The boy just watched him, weighing him, judging him. Then with a slow, reluctant nod, he loosened his grip on his sister. Minutes later they were riding out, the prairie stretching endless and merciless ahead. The little girl, Lily, was a feverish weight in Colt's arms, her weak breath ghosting against his chest. The boy Wyatt clung to him from behind, his small bony hands clutching Colt's ribs. He had come for a saddle, a simple piece of leather and wood. He was leaving with something far, far heavier, and fate, that cruel and twisted puppeteer, wasn't anywhere near done with him yet. The coming night would bring a reckoning he couldn't possibly imagine. The prairie night fell fast, the sun bleeding out behind the hills like a butchered animal. The stars punched holes in the black canvas of the sky, sharp and cold and indifferent. Colt Remington rode through the darkness, the weight of two small bodies pressed against him heavier than any sin he'd ever carried. Lily was burning up, her small limbs limp as a rag doll. Wyatt clung to his waist, a silent, rigid passenger. Through the thin fabric of his shirt, Colt could feel the boy's ribs, sharp and fragile, a testament to days of starvation. The town of Samaran Flats appeared on the horizon, a pathetic scatter of buildings against the vast empty plains. A saloon with broken shutters, a general store with peeling paint, and a sheriff's office with a single lamp guttering behind a dirty window. It was a town gasping for its last breath. Colt pulled Dusty to a stop outside the Horseshoe Saloon. Stale light and the low hum of slurred voices spilled through the swinging doors. Wyatt shifted behind him, his voice a raw whisper. "We ain't going in there, are we?" "No," Colt said, dismounting with an aching groan. He lifted Lily with practiced care, her skin slick with sweat. The girl stirred weakly, her lashes fluttering against her flushed cheeks. "We're finding help." Wyatt slid off the horse, his eyes darting around like a cornered coyote. "Ain't nobody helps," he stated, not as a fear, but as a fact. "They will tonight." With Lily in one arm, Colt pushed through the saloon doors. The place went dead silent. A piano player stopped mid-tune. Men hunched over whiskey glasses froze. The barkeep, a narrow-eyed man with thinning hair, stopped polishing a glass. Every eye in the room turned to the stranger, broad-shouldered, dust-caked, a gun on his hip, and two starving children in his arms. In the corner, a man with a tarnished badge half hidden under his coat slowly lowered his boots from a crate. Sheriff Delaney. His gaze drifted to Colt, squinting under the brim of his weathered hat. "Well, I'll be," Delaney muttered, his voice thick with rye. "Colt Remington. Thought you were long gone or long buried." Colt ignored the greeting. Need a doc. Delaney's eyes dropped to the girl in Colt's arms, to her ragged breaths and fever-bright face. Doc's 2 buildings down, but you don't bring children into Samarin Flats this time of night, not unless you're dragging trouble right behind you. His gaze sharpened, turning hard. Where'd you get 'em? Bought 'em, Colt said flatly. The saloon erupted in a low murmur of whispers and scraping chairs. A few hands drifted toward holsters. This wasn't just trouble. This was something else entirely. Delaney rose slowly, deliberately. Bought 'em from who? Jed McGraw. The barkeep cursed under his breath. Delaney's jaw tightened into a hard line. McGraw's been running stock across state lines for years, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Stock that walks and cries. The sheriff's eyes bored into Colt. You paid him? I paid him, Colt confirmed, adjusting Lily's limp weight. And tomorrow I'll burn his damn barn to the ground. But right now I need that doc. The sheriff hesitated for a split second, then waved a hand. Follow me. They slipped out into the cold night air, leaving the stunned silence of the saloon behind them. Wyatt stuck close to Colt. His small hand knotted in the fabric of Colt's coat. The doctor's office was a dim, cramped room that smelled of whiskey and iodine. Doc Cooper, a wiry man with a balding head and weary eyes, looked up from his desk. Another one sick? He asked, his tone laced with resignation. Worse, Colt replied, laying Lily down on a narrow cot. Neglect, fever, maybe worse. The doctor's face pinched as he examined the child. His practiced fingers probed her thin arms, peeled back an eyelid, pressed a palm to her flushed forehead. She's weak, Cooper muttered. Needs fluids, rest, something to break this fever. He moved to a cabinet filled with dusty brown bottles. But this ain't a normal fever. It's too aggressive. Almost intentional. Colt's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Doc Cooper glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wide with a fear that went beyond medical concern. I've seen it before. Small doses of wolfsbane, mixed in the water. Doesn't kill him right away. Just keeps him weak, docile, easier to transport. The room spun. This wasn't just neglect. This was methodical, calculated cruelty. McGraw wasn't just a slaver. He was a monster. Sheriff Delaney watched Colt, his expression grim. You plan on keeping him? Colt's gaze was hard and unyielding. I ain't leaving them. Delaney sighed, pulling his hat lower. You just made some powerful enemies, Remington. McGraw don't take kindly to folks meddling in his business. I ain't fond of men who poison children. The sheriff's lips twitched into a faint, bitter smirk. Funny, you always did pick the ugliest fights. While Doc Cooper worked, wiping Lily's face with a cool cloth and preparing a tonic, Delaney turned to Wyatt. The boy stood near the door, a tiny, silent sentinel. Where's your folks, son? The sheriff asked gently. Dead, Wyatt said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Ma got sick. After she died, McGraw came. Said she owed him. Said Lily was his payment. The boy's jaw clenched, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Delaney shook his head, a curse escaping his lips. Jesus! Colt knelt beside Wyatt, placing a hand on his shoulder. Ain't nobody taking her now. Not her, not you. Wyatt's gaze flicked from Colt to Lily and back again. Suspicion still lingered, but beneath it, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout. An hour later, Lily was sleeping under a worn quilt, her fever easing slightly. Doc Cooper promised to watch over her through the night. Colt stood in the doorway, staring out at the dark, empty streets. You gonna run? Delaney asked, stepping up beside him. No, Colt replied. The word was quiet, but it was carved from stone. I just started this. The sheriff's expression tightened. You know McGraw doesn't work alone, right? He answers to Rafe Harlan, the man who runs the trails from here to Santa Fe. Smuggling, slavery, worse. I know the name. Then you know what's coming for you. Colt nodded. Out on the plains, a coyote howled, a lonely, mournful sound. Wyatt appeared at his side, silent as a shadow. If you leave, the boy said, his voice barely a whisper, they'll come back for us. Colt looked down at the boy, at the fierce, desperate loyalty in his eyes. His own son, Samuel, would have been about this age. The thought was a knife in his gut. "I ain't leaving," he said. The boy studied his face, weighing the words like a man twice his age. Then, with a small, reluctant nod, he turned and went back inside to sit by his sister. The streets of Samarin Flats were quiet, but the dust carried whispers. Colt Remington had ridden into town looking for a saddle. Instead, he'd bought himself a war, and the opening shots were about to be fired. The morning sun crept over the Samaran Flats like a lazy predator, its orange glow spilling across the cracked earth. But the peace was a lie. Colt Remington could feel it in his bones, the kind of dead, heavy stillness that only comes before a storm. Inside Doc Cooper's office, Lily slept, her breathing steadier. The pale flush on her cheeks was a ghost of the fever that had nearly claimed her. Wyatt sat on a wooden stool beside her, a small, fierce gargoyle guarding a precious treasure. Colt stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the street. The townsfolk moved like shadows, their steps hurried, their eyes downcast. News traveled fast in a place like this, and fear traveled even faster. Sheriff Delaney leaned in the doorway, chewing on a sprig of dry grass. "McGraw's howling mad," he muttered, spitting the grass aside. "Sent a rider out before sunup, headed straight for Rafe Harlan's camp." Colt didn't flinch. "Good." Delaney shot him a look of disbelief. "Good? You just poked a hornet's nest with a short stick, Remington. You better be ready for the sting." "I've been stung worse." "Not by Harlan, you haven't," the sheriff countered, his voice tight as drawn wire. "He doesn't just run freight lines. He owns men. He owns this town. You think buying those kids for a handful of silver was the end of it? It was just the start." Before Colt could reply, the door to the office slammed open, and Jed McGraw stormed in, his face a mask of purple rage. "You low-down bastard!" McGraw spat, jabbing a thick, dirty finger at Colt's chest. "You think you're some kind of saint? Those brats ain't yours to save." Colt's eyes narrowed to icy slits. "They are now." "You just bought yourself a grave, Remington." McGraw lunged, his meaty fists swinging wildly. Colt sidestepped the clumsy attack with the easy grace of a man who'd spent a lifetime in brutal fights. He caught McGraw's wrist, twisting it hard. The rancher grunted in pain, his knees buckling. "You sold them like cattle," Colt hissed, his voice low and deadly. "You poisoned a little girl. You don't get to play righteous now." "A debt's a debt," McGraw snarled, trying to wrench his arm free. "The debt is paid in full." Suddenly, McGraw's face twisted into a cruel, triumphant smirk. "You think this is just about some dead woman's debt? You really are a fool." He spat on the floorboards, his eyes glittering with malice. "Their mama wasn't just some homesteader. She was going to talk. She had ledgers, names, dates, roots, everything. She was going to bring Harlan down." The air in the room grew thick and heavy. This wasn't just about two children. It was about silencing a threat. The kids weren't just leverage. They were loose ends. "You're dumber than you look," McGraw sneered, his confidence swelling. "Harlan's not just coming for the kids, Remington. He's coming to bury evidence, and you're standing right on top of it." He finally tore his arm free, his face dark with renewed rage. "When he gets here, this whole damn town will see what happens when you cross him. I ain't afraid of cowards who sell children." McGraw just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He stomped out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Delaney let out a long, slow breath. "You sure know how to stir up a mess?" Colt's gaze drifted to Wyatt. The boy's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the stool. He'd heard every word. "We're leaving," Colt said finally. "Now." "Where to?" Delaney asked. "Cabin, North Ridge, old cattle trail." The sheriff hesitated. "That place? Your place?" Colt gave a single sharp nod. "Ain't much, but it's defendable." It was the last remnant of his old life, the home he'd built with Martha before the sickness came and carved him hollow. "I'll give you an hour's head start," Delaney said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "After that, I'd be watching your back trail." Colt packed quickly. Water, bread, and every last cartridge he owned. Wyatt helped, his movements swift and silent, his eyes never straying far from Lily. Colt lifted the sleeping girl gently, wrapping her in his heavy duster. Her small frame felt impossibly fragile. As he mounted Dusty, with Wyatt climbing on behind him, the entire town seemed to be watching. Silent faces peered from behind curtains. No one spoke. No one offered help. Cimarron Flats was a town held hostage by fear. The ride north was a grim, silent journey. The cabin, when it came into view, was little more than a weathered shack tucked against the rugged hills. The porch sagged, the windows were boarded, and the barn had half collapsed. But it was still standing, and for now it was a fortress. Inside, dust coated every surface. A rocking chair by the hearth stood untouched, just as Martha had left it. A faded quilt lay folded on the bed, and in the corner the cradle Colt had carved with his own hands sat empty, a silent monument to a life that had been stolen from him. The pain was so sharp it nearly brought him to his knees. Wyatt hovered near the door, his eyes scanning every shadow, every creaking floorboard. "It's safe," Colt said, laying Lily on the bed. He fetched water from the pump, dampened a cloth, and pressed it to her forehead. The boy didn't move. His voice was a quiet, world-weary statement. "Safe don't last." Colt's jaw tightened. "It does now." They worked through the rest of the day, their movements driven by a desperate urgency. They reinforced the door, cleared the chimney, and checked the locks. Wyatt proved to be a survivor, sharp and quick with a hatchet, his hands steady with a rope. He worked with the grim focus of a soldier preparing for battle. By nightfall, a fire crackled in the hearth. Lily slept, her breathing shallow but peaceful. Wyatt sat by the door, a small skinning knife Colt had given him laid across his knees, his eyes wide and hard in the firelight. Colt sat across from him, cleaning his revolver with slow, methodical movements. The familiar rhythm of oiling the cylinder and checking the hammer was a small comfort in a world spiraling out of control. Outside, the prairie wind howled, carrying the distant cry of coyotes. But Colt knew it wasn't just coyotes they had to worry about. Harlan was out there. He was watching, he was waiting, but so was Colt Remington. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for ghosts. He was fighting for the living, and he would burn the world down to keep them safe. The morning broke mean and gray, clouds hanging low over the hills like a wet canvas shroud. Colt stood on the porch, the chill biting through his coat as he scanned the empty landscape to the south. Nothing moved. Not yet. Inside, the fire snapped softly. Lily was awake, propped up on some pillows, her fever gone, but her skin still as pale as driftwood. She watched Wyatt as he methodically sharpened the skinning knife on a whetstone, his small face a mask of concentration. Colt turned from the empty hills, his boots creaking across the floorboards. He poured a tin of black coffee, bitter and burned, and took a long sip. The heat did little to warm the ice in his gut. "You don't have to guard her like that," Colt said, his voice rough with sleep and smoke. Wyatt didn't look up from his work. "If I don't, nobody will." Colt set his tin down and squatted beside the boy. "You think I brought you all the way out here just to leave you?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "You paid for us. That was the deal." Colt's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't pay to own you, boy. I paid so no one else could." For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Lily's quiet breathing. Finally, Wyatt's shoulders slumped, just a fraction. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall of defiance he had built around himself. Colt rose, pulling on his coat. "Stay put. Bar the door behind me. I'll be back." The ride into Cimarron Flats felt like riding into a graveyard. The town was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable violence. As Colt tied Dusty outside the sheriff's office, eyes followed him from behind drawn curtains. Fear was a sickness, and it had infected every soul in this town. Inside, Sheriff Delaney was hunched over his desk, nursing a bottle of whiskey that smelled like it had been brewed in hell. He looked up as Colt entered, his eyes bloodshot but sharp. "You always did like walking right into the fire, didn't you, Remington?" Delaney asked, his voice a low rasp. Colt closed the door. "Harlan?" The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temples. "He's here, camped out on the South Trail with a handful of his dogs. But that ain't the worst of it." He shoved a crumpled piece of paper across the desk. It was a wanted poster, the ink faded, the drawing crude but unmistakable. It was a much younger Rafe Harlan, but it was the name written beneath it that made Colt's heart stop. Rafe Remington. Colt stared at the poster, his mind reeling. That's not possible. Your cousin, ain't he? Delaney said quietly. Heard the family had a bad split years back. Something about stolen money and a dead brother. The past came rushing back at Colt like a flash flood. His uncle, a gambler and a cheat. His cousin Rafe, who had always been rotten to the core. The fire that had killed Rafe's brother, a fire everyone had blamed on faulty wiring, but Colt had always suspected was something more sinister. Rafe had disappeared after that, and Colt had never heard the name Remington attached to him again. Until now. This wasn't just business. This was family. This was a blood feud. He knows about this cabin, Colt said, the words tasting like ash. He's been here before. Delaney nodded grimly. He knows every rock and every ravine. You didn't run to a fortress, Colt. You ran straight into the heart of his territory. Colt turned for the door, his mind a whirlwind of rage and betrayal. Where are you going? Delaney called after him. Home. You ever consider just leaving? The sheriff asked, his voice weary. Riding west and never looking back. Colt paused at the threshold, his hand on the worn wood. Did that once, he said, his voice barely a whisper. After Martha and Samuel died. It didn't work. The ghost ride faster than any horse. The ride back to the cabin was a blur. The prairie wind whipped at his face, whispering secrets of a past he had tried so desperately to bury. Wyatt met him on the porch, his face pinched with worry. Someone was here, the boy blurted out before Colt could even dismount. Didn't knock, just watch from the ridge. Colt's spine went rigid. Did you see his face? No, Wyatt said, shaking his head. Too far. But I saw his horse, a big black stallion, mean-looking, and it was branded with a crooked R, a Remington brand. Rafe had been here himself. He wasn't just sending his men. He was savoring this. He was toying with him. Colt stormed inside. Lily stirred on the bed, her small face filled with fear. Colt checked the rifle by the door, loaded fresh shells into his revolver, and surveyed the cabin with a soldier's eye. This wasn't just a home anymore. It was a tomb. His tomb, the one Rafe had been digging for him for years. They ate a quiet, tense supper. Beans, stale bread, and watered-down coffee. Wyatt barely touched his plate, his eyes flitting to the window every few seconds. Night fell heavy and suffocating. The wind howled through the hills like the souls of the damned. Colt sat by the fire, his rifle across his lap, his boots planted firm on the floorboards he had laid with his own 2 hands. Wyatt curled up on a blanket nearby, the skinning knife clutched in his fist. Lily slept fitfully, her small hands clutching a frayed doll that Colt hadn't noticed before. It must have been her mother's. The ghosts of his past and present converged in that small dusty cabin. The cousin who had become a monster. The wife and son he couldn't save. And the 2 small, terrified children who represented his last, desperate chance at redemption. Somewhere out in the darkness, his own blood was watching, waiting, plotting his destruction. But Colt Remington was done running. If Rafe wanted a family reunion, Colt would be sure to give him one he'd never forget. The sun hadn't yet breached the horizon when Colt woke to the sound of a single horse approaching. It wasn't the thunder of a dozen riders. It was a slow, deliberate trot. The sound of a messenger, not an army. He rose from his chair by the hearth, his hand already on the butt of his revolver. Outside, the pre-dawn air was cold and still. The wind had died, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Wyatt was already at the door, peering through a crack in the wood, the knife clutched tight in his hand. Colt eased the door open just enough to see. A lone figure sat on horseback about 50 yards from the porch, a silhouette against the pale graying sky. The man was tall and broad, a rifle resting casually across his lap. His hat was pulled low, but there was no mistaking the frame of Zeke Boone. They had ridden together years ago, fought side by side in the war, split bottles of whiskey, and traded stories of scars, both seen and unseen. That was before Zeke started riding with men like Rafe Harlan, before silver had bought his loyalty and tarnished his soul. Thought you might still be too stubborn to run, Colt. Zeke's voice boomed across the still air. Colt stepped out onto the porch, his boots grinding in the dirt. Never been much good at running, Zeke. You know that. The big man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. No, you ain't. He swung down from his horse, his movements slow and non-threatening. They stood in silence for a moment, the ghosts of their shared past swirling between them in the morning mist. You here for talking or for trouble? Colt finally asked. Bit of both, Zeke said, hooking his thumbs in his belt. Rafe wants those kids. He says they're stolen property. They're children, Zeke, not property. Zeke tilted his head, studying Colt with a look of pity. You always did have a taste for lost causes. And you always had a taste for bad company. A grin tugged at the corner of Zeke's mouth, but it didn't reach his cold, hard eyes. Listen, I ain't here to draw on you. This is a courtesy. A warning. Rafe knows you're his blood. He says that gives him the right to settle this the old way. He's offering you a choice. Colt's hand hovered near his belt. I'm listening. He says you hand over the boy, and you can keep the girl. Raise her as your own. A replacement for the one you lost. The words hit Colt like a physical blow. Rafe knew about Samuel. He was twisting the knife, using Colt's own grief as a weapon against him. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Why does he want Wyatt so bad? Colt asked, his voice dangerously low. Zeke shrugged, but his eyes darted away for a split second, a flicker of a lie. He's a strong boy, good for labor. But Colt saw it. He saw the lie. That's not it, Zeke. Tell me. Zeke hesitated, the ghost of the man he used to be flickering behind his eyes. He let out a long, heavy sigh. The boy, Wyatt, he ain't who you think he is. His ma wasn't just some homesteader who owed McGraw a debt. He paused as if weighing the consequences of his next words. His pa is Rafe Harlan. The world tilted again. McGraw's story about the ledgers was a lie. The whole thing was a lie. Rafe had a son with that woman years ago, Zeke continued, his voice barely a whisper. But she ran, took the boy, changed her name. Rafe's been hunting him ever since. Not 'cause he loves the kid, 'cause the boy is his only heir. The only thing that can carry on the Remington name he's built his filthy empire on. He wants his legacy secured. Lily wasn't the target. She was just collateral damage. Wyatt was the prize. So Rafe sent McGraw to get his son back. Colt pieced it together, his mind racing. And McGraw decided to poison a little girl and try to sell them both for a profit. Zeke nodded grimly. Rafe ain't happy with how McGraw handled things, but he wants his son. He's coming for him, Colt, with or without your permission. Colt's hand closed into a fist, his knuckles creaking. He looked toward the cabin, where the faint shadow of Wyatt was visible in the window. A boy caught in a war he didn't even know he was a part of. He ain't getting him, Colt said, the words carved from granite. Zeke exhaled slowly, a man burying the last shred of his conscience. Then you better fortify this place, old friend, 'cause when Rafe comes, it ain't gonna be with talk. It's gonna be with fire and lead. You coming with him? Zeke hesitated, his gaze drifting to the cabin door. Not if I can help it. With that, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back down the trail, his silhouette shrinking against the rising sun. He left Colt standing alone on the porch, the weight of this new, terrible truth pressing down on him. The rest of the day was a blur of frantic preparation. Colt and Wyatt reinforced the windows with planks pulled from the dilapidated barn. They stacked firewood by the door and counted their cartridges twice. Colt showed Wyatt how to set snares along the ridgeline. Not to kill, but to warn. The boy learned fast, his small hands steady, his eyes filled with a grim understanding that was far too old for his years. They cleared out the root cellar, stocking it with water and what little food they had left. If it gets bad, Colt told Wyatt, his voice low and serious, you take Lily down there. You lock it from the inside, and you don't come out until it's quiet. You understand me? What about you? The boy asked, his voice trembling slightly. Colt met his gaze, his expression as unyielding as bedrock. I ain't leaving. The sun dipped low, painting the clouds in shades of blood and fire. Lily's fever had finally broken that evening. She was sitting up, sipping water, her eyes glassy but clear. "You ain't gonna let him take us, are you?" she whispered, her small voice rasping. Colt brushed the damp hair from her forehead. "Ain't nobody taking you. Ever." Night fell, and with it came the prairie wind, cold and strong, carrying the distant echo of hoofbeats. Rafe Remington, was coming. He was coming for his son. He was coming to erase a past Colt was just beginning to understand. And Colt would have to become a monster to fight one. The next 2 days passed like the slow burn of a dynamite fuse. The silence was heavy, thick with the promise of violence. Colt and Wyatt worked from sunup to sundown, turning the dilapidated cabin into a makeshift fortress. They reinforced the door with heavy timber beams. They lined the windows with sandbags made from old grain sacks. They cleared a wide circle of brush around the homestead, leaving any approaching rider exposed and vulnerable. The root cellar became their final sanctuary, stocked and secured. Lily, though still weak, insisted on helping. She folded blankets and carried small pails of water, her face pinched with a determination that belied her 6 years. She was a survivor, just like her brother, just like Colt. On the third morning, with the clouds bruising the horizon, Sheriff Delaney rode up the trail. His horse was lathered with sweat, and his face was a grim mask of resignation. "They're coming," he announced, dismounting with a weary grunt. "Harlan's gathered his men, a dozen of them. McGraw's riding with him. They'll be here by sundown." Colt wasn't surprised. "You don't have to stay, Sheriff." Delaney's eyes swept over the fortified cabin, a flicker of something, respect perhaps, in his gaze. "You're really planning to hold here? To end this right here?" He shook his head, then reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Colt unwrapped it. Nestled inside were 6 sticks of dynamite. "Old mining camp outside of Tolosa," Delaney said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Figured you'd appreciate a proper welcome mat." "I do." They worked quickly, bearing the dynamite near the old collapsed shed that marked the southern approach to the cabin. They rigged it with a tripwire and a long fuse. It wasn't meant to kill, just to sow chaos, to scatter the attackers and buy them precious, life-saving seconds. Wyatt helped string a line of jagged tin cans between the porch posts, a crude but effective early alarm system. By the time the sun began to dip behind the western hills, the homestead was ready. They ate a final, quiet supper of beans and jerky. The air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken fear and grim resolve. "Sheriff," Colt said, glancing at Delaney, "last chance to ride." The old lawman snorted, thumbing the hammers of his shotgun. "I buried my family years ago, Remington. Ain't got much left worth running for. Besides," he added, a dangerous glint in his eye, "I owe Rafe Harlan for what he's done to my town." Colt nodded once. Nothing more needed to be said. As darkness consumed the prairie, the world fell silent. No crickets, no coyotes, just the restless whisper of the wind. It started with the faint creak of saddle leather, then the muffled thud of hooves on dry earth, then voices, low and confident, dripping with the arrogance of men who believe they are invincible. Colt peered through a crack in the window shutter. A dozen riders fanned out across the yard, their silhouettes framed by the rising moon. At their head, Rafe Remington, sat tall in the saddle, a cigar glowing like a single demonic eye in the darkness. Beside him, Jed McGraw hunched in his saddle, his face twisted in a hateful sneer. Zeke Boone was not among them. Rafe's voice, slick as oil and cold as a grave, carried across the empty yard. "Colt, cousin, you got something that belongs to me. Send out my boy and I'll let the rest of you die quick." Colt stepped out onto the porch, his Winchester held low but ready. The faint light from the doorway cast his shadow long and menacing at his feet. "He ain't your son, Rafe," Colt called back, his voice steady and clear. "Not anymore." Rafe chuckled, the sound devoid of all humor. "Blood is blood, cousin. You of all people should know that. You can't break that chain just 'cause your conscience got a little itchy." "That chain's breaking tonight," Rafe sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. "I knew you'd say that. You always did have to pick the ugly side of a fight." He raised his hand, a silent command. McGraw and the other riders kicked their horses forward, their guns drawn. Colt's voice cut through the tension like a razor. "Now!" Hidden behind the shed, Wyatt, his face illuminated by a single trembling spark, struck a match and lit the fuse. A heartbeat later, the world exploded. The dynamite erupted in a deafening roar of fire, dirt, and shrapnel. Men and horses were thrown through the air, their screams swallowed by the blast. The yard was plunged into a swirling vortex of smoke and chaos. From the window, Delaney's shotgun cracked like thunder, dropping one of the riders clean off his mount. The battle had begun. Colt rolled off the porch as bullets splintered the wood where he'd been standing. His Winchester barked twice, one shot catching a man in the thigh, the other grazing McGraw's shoulder as the rancher dove for cover behind a water trough. Rafe shouted orders, trying to rally his terrified, disoriented men. From behind the woodpile, Wyatt, armed with an old slingshot Colt had found, launched a jagged rock that smashed into another rider's face, sending him sprawling. Colt closed the distance on McGraw, driving the butt of his rifle into the man's ribs. They tumbled into the dirt, a desperate, grunting tangle of fists and boots. McGraw swung wildly, but grief and righteous fury had made Colt stronger, faster. He slammed his elbow into McGraw's jaw, then pinned the man to the ground, the muzzle of his revolver pressing hard against his temple. "I told you," Colt growled, his voice a low snarl of pure hatred. "You ain't taking him." McGraw's eyes widened with terror, the bravado draining out of him like blood from a fatal wound. But the fight wasn't over. A shadow loomed behind Colt. It was Rafe, his pistol drawn, a cold, triumphant sneer carved across his face. "End of the line, cousin." Before Colt could react, another shot rang out. But it didn't come from Rafe's gun. It came from the cabin doorway. There stood Lily, barely steady on her feet, holding Colt's smaller pistol in both of her small, trembling hands. Smoke curled from the barrel. Rafe's shoulder jerked as the bullet tore through his coat, grazing his flesh. He staggered back, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. Colt seized the moment. He twisted McGraw's arm behind his back, slamming him face first into the dirt, his own revolver never wavering. Rafe cursed, clutching his wounded shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he realized the fight was lost. "You think this is done?" he hissed, his voice venomous. Colt's reply was quiet, deadly. "It's only just starting." The surviving riders, seeing their leader wounded and their numbers decimated, bolted into the darkness, dragging Rafe with them. The yard fell silent, the only sounds the ragged breathing of the living and the low groans of the wounded. Delaney stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun still smoking. Colt knelt by Lily, gently prying the hot pistol from her small, trembling fingers. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and gunpowder, a mixture of fear and fierce pride in her wide eyes. "You stayed," she whispered. Colt nodded, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. "Told you I would." As the prairie wind howled across the blood-soaked yard, carrying the smell of gunpowder and churned earth, Colt Remington knew this wasn't the end. It was just a pause. Rafe would be back. But tonight, they had won. They were still breathing, and in a place like this, that was everything. The smell of burned powder and spilled blood clung to the cabin long after the gunfire faded. It was the scent of survival, bitter and sharp. Colt stood by the window, watching the first hints of dawn paint the eastern sky a bruised purple. His shoulder ached, his ribs were on fire, but he was upright. That was all that mattered. Behind him, Wyatt moved quietly through the cabin, collecting the spent shell casings from the floorboards. The boy's small face was set in a grim mask of determination. He hadn't spoken since the fight ended, but his eyes told the story, weary, calculating, and far too old. Lily sat curled on the bed, pale but resolute, clutching the frayed doll that had become her anchor in this storm. Sheriff Delaney stirred the fire, his expression unreadable as he loaded fresh shells into his shotgun. "They'll be back," he muttered, breaking the long silence. Colt didn't need to be told. "How many this time?" "More," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "Rafe's got a brother, Clayton. Runs the whole operation from Amarillo to Santa Fe. Meaner, colder, richer. When he hears Rafe was beaten, he'll come looking to restore the family name." "Let him," Colt said, his jaw tight. Delaney shook his head, wiping a smear of soot from his face. "This ain't just about pride now, Colt. You humiliated Rafe. Clayton will want to make an example of you. A slow, painful example. Colt turned from the window and knelt beside Lily, brushing a strand of tangled hair from her cheek. "You did good, darling," he said gently. Her eyes flicked to the pistol now lying on the table. I I was scared." "Me too," Colt admitted. Wyatt looked up from his task, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Scared keeps you sharp," Colt added, his gaze meeting the boy's. "Scared means you still have something worth losing." The boy absorbed that, a silent understanding passing between them. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and empty, but the land itself felt different now. It felt charged, waiting. Blood had been spilled here. More would surely follow. They spent the day patching their defenses. The front porch, splintered and scarred, was reinforced with timber from the ruined shed. The traps along the ridge were reset, sharpened, and better hidden. Just before dusk, a lone rider appeared on the ridge. Not at a gallop, but at a slow, cautious walk, his hands held high and away from his guns. It was Zeke Boone. Colt, Wyatt, and Delaney met him by the woodpile, their rifles ready. Zeke dismounted, his broad frame slouched with exhaustion, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Put the irons down, boys," Zeke said, his voice rough. "I ain't here to bleed." Colt kept his rifle leveled. "Didn't see you last night." "Didn't fire a shot against you neither," Zeke countered. He spat on the ground, then shook his head. "I'm done riding with him. For good." The silence stretched, taut as a tripwire. Finally, Colt lowered his rifle an inch. "Why the change of heart, Zeke?" Zeke's gaze drifted to the cabin, to the faint shadow of Lily watching from the window. "I signed on to move freight, not to kill children." Rafe crossed a line. His eyes darkened. "And Clayton doesn't have any lines." "He's coming?" Delaney asked. "He's already here," Zeke confirmed. "Gathering men in Samarin Flats. A dozen, maybe more. All killers, all paid in blood money. They'll ride at sunup." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, heavy case. He handed it to Colt. Inside, nestled in oiled cloth, were 6 pristine, brass-cased cartridges. They were heavier than normal shells, their tips engraved with a small, intricate design. "45-70s, Zeke explained. "Armor-piercing. Bought 'em off of Pinkerton in El Paso. They'll go through anything. Figured you might have a use for 'em." He paused. "I can't stay and fight. Clayton knows my face. He'd burn this place to the ground before the fight even started just to get to me. But I can slow him down, 'cause some chaos on the trail." Colt took the cartridges, weighing their significance in his palm. He nodded once. "Then do it." Zeke swung back onto his horse. "Good luck, Remington." He tipped his hat to Wyatt. "You're a braver man than your father ever was, kid." As Zeke rode off into the growing dusk, Wyatt asked quietly, "You trust him?" "No," Colt replied, loading the special cartridges into his Winchester. "But sometimes you take the help you're given." The night before the battle was heavy with a final, desperate calm. They dug shallow trenches in the front yard. They reinforced the window shutters. Wyatt packed cartridges with trembling but steady hands. Colt sat on the porch, watching the horizon bleed from orange to black. "You ain't scared now?" Wyatt asked, settling beside him. Colt thought for a moment. "Terrified," he admitted. Wyatt blinked. "But you ain't showing it." "Don't need to," Colt said, offering the boy a faint, grim smile. "But scared's good, remember. It means we're still alive." Dawn approached like a slow, steady drumbeat. By first light they came, a dozen riders, their silhouettes jagged against the pale, bloody sky. At the front rode a man in a spotless black coat, his face lean and sharp, his eyes as cold and dead as a winter frost. Clayton Harlan. Colt stood on the porch, his rifle ready. Wyatt was at his side, Delaney at the window. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. Clayton's voice, oily and confident, slithered across the yard. "Remington, you have cost my family a great deal of trouble. I'm here to collect the debt. Hand over the boy, and maybe I'll leave the girl alive to mourn you." Colt's reply was quiet, but it echoed across the plains with the finality of a closing coffin lid. "Ain't happening." Clayton's cold smile widened. "Then burn it all." The riders surged forward, a wave of death and destruction, their guns blazing. The final battle for the homestead, for two children, for the soul of Colt Remington, had begun. The first shots cracked through the air like a lightning storm breaking directly overhead. Colt's Winchester kicked against his shoulder, one of Zeke's armor-piercing rounds screaming across the yard. It struck the lead rider square in the chest, punching clean through the man and the horse behind him. Both went down in a screaming, bloody heap. Clayton Harlan's men faltered, shocked by the sudden, brutal force. They expected easy prey, not a hurricane. From the window, Delaney's shotgun roared, sending another man sprawling in the dust. Wyatt, crouched low by the porch steps, fired the old revolver, his small hands steady, his face a mask of grim focus. The tin can alarm rattled as another rider tripped the wire, exposing his position just long enough for Delaney's second barrel to find him. But there were too many. The remaining riders dismounted, using the trough and the woodpile for cover, laying down a withering field of fire. Bullets chewed into the porch posts, splinters slicing past Colt's cheek. Inside the cabin, a stray round slammed into the wall, inches from where Lily was huddled. Colt's blood ran cold. "Sheriff, cover me!" he bellowed. Delaney fired twice, forcing the attackers to duck. Colt sprinted inside, grabbing a heavy blanket and wrapping it around the terrified little girl. "Root cellar!" he shouted to Wyatt. "Now!" The boy dashed ahead, low and fast, disappearing behind the chicken coop toward the hidden cellar door. Colt followed, Lily clutched tight in his arms, bullets snapping at his heels. He set her down inside the dark, cool space. "You stay here," he commanded, his eyes locking with hers. "You don't come out, no matter what you hear." Wyatt gripped Colt's wrist, his young face desperate. "Don't let him take her." "They ain't taking nobody." Colt sealed the hatch, brushed dirt and brush back over it, and turned back to the fight. He arrived just in time to see Sheriff Delaney stagger back from the window, clutching his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. "Just a graze," the old lawman grunted, but his face was pale. They were losing. The cabin wouldn't hold for much longer. Clayton Harlan himself advanced now, walking calmly through the gunfire as if he were taking a Sunday stroll. "It's over, Remington," he called, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Your little show is done." Colt's reply was another rifle shot, this one clipping the brim of Clayton's fine black hat. The outlaw's expression soured. "I tried to be reasonable," he muttered. He raised his hand. From behind the ridge, more riders emerged. 6 of them. Fresh reinforcements. Colt cursed under his breath. It was over. But before the new riders could charge, a series of gunshots cracked from the trees to the east. One of the fresh men tumbled from his horse, then another. Panic rippled through Clayton's forces as shadows moved among the trees. It was Zeke, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were a half-dozen men, ranchers, storekeeps, the quiet, downtrodden folk of Samarin Flats. They were armed with hunting rifles and old shotguns, their faces set with a newfound courage. Delaney and Doc Cooper's secret work had paid off. The town had finally decided to fight back. The ambush turned the tide. Colt and Delaney surged forward, laying down covering fire. Clayton's calm veneer finally cracked as his forces were caught in a brutal crossfire. Within minutes, the yard was littered with the bodies of his men. Clayton, seeing the battle lost, wheeled his stallion around, spurring it hard toward the open plains. But Zeke Boone stepped directly into his path, his Winchester leveled. "You ain't riding far, Harlan." Clayton's eyes flashed with pure, murderous fury. "You betray your own kind for this trash?" "You and me stopped being kin a long time ago," Zeke said, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a single, final shot echoed across the homestead. Colt stood 20 yards away, smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt Navy. Clayton Harlan's eyes went wide with surprise, then glazed over with the emptiness of death. He toppled from his saddle and landed with a dull thud in the Texas dirt. Silence fell. The surviving men dropped their weapons. It was finished. Hours later, the dead were buried in shallow, unmarked graves behind the ridge. Zeke and the townsfolk helped repair the porch. "Place is looking better already," Zeke said, a tired but genuine grin on his face. Delaney, his arm bandaged by Doc Cooper, leaned against the doorway, watching the last of the dust settle. You sure it's over? Wyatt and Lily were sitting on the steps, Lily leaning her head against his shoulder. Colt knelt before them, meeting their tired but hopeful eyes. For now, he said honestly, but we'll be ready if it's not. Lily reached out and clutched his hand. We're staying here. With you? Colt looked around at the battered cabin, at the faces of the people who had risked everything, at the two children who had given him a reason to live again. He wasn't just a man with ghosts anymore. He was a man with a future. Yeah, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he thought he'd lost forever. We're building something new here. The prairie stretched wide and dangerous beyond the hills, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like home. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a family, forged in fire, bound by blood, and ready to defend the small piece of the world that was theirs. If you enjoyed this story and you want to hear more tales of justice from the forgotten corners of the world, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what you might find in the darkness.